In October 2022, a senior US Treasury official testified before Congress that America's sanctions regime was the most powerful financial weapon ever deployed in peacetime. He was right. At that moment, the United States maintained active sanctions against over 20 countries and more than 12,000 designated entities. It had frozen $300 billion in Russian sovereign reserves, disconnected Iranian banks from global payment infrastructure, and reduced North Korea to a barter economy. What the testimony did not address was what happens when the most sanctioned nations on earth stop trying to break out of the sanctions individually and start building a system together specifically designed to make the next round of sanctions irrelevant. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, the four nations that analysts now refer to as the CRINK Bloc, have collectively absorbed more US financial pressure than any other group of nations in recorded history. And over the past decade, they have responded not by complying, not by capitulating, but by constructing a parallel economic and financial architecture that operates outside the reach of American monetary power. This is how they built it, and why it may be the most consequential geopolitical development of the 21st century that most people have never heard of. The four nations did not plan this. The alliance was not designed at a summit. It emerged from a shared structural problem and a shared enemy. North Korea has been under comprehensive US sanctions since 2006, when it conducted its first nuclear test. Its economy was effectively expelled from the global financial system. No SWIFT access, no dollar clearing, no legitimate international trade beyond the small amount China permitted. Pyongyang responded by building an entirely off-books economy, weapons exports to Middle Eastern and African buyers, industrial-scale methamphetamine manufacturing for export to East Asian markets, and beginning in 2016, systematic state-sponsored cryptocurrency theft. By 2024, North Korean state hackers, operating primarily through the Lazarus Group, had stolen over $3 billion in digital assets, funding a nuclear arsenal that has grown to an estimated 40 to 60 warheads despite decades of international pressure. Iran has operated under escalating US sanctions since the 1979 revolution, over 40 years of financial exclusion that represents the longest sustained economic warfare campaign in American history. When the United States and European Union disconnected Iranian banks from SWIFT in 2012, Iran lost approximately half of its oil export revenue within 6 months. But the disconnection also accelerated Iran's development of alternative channels, barter trade with Iraq settled in local currencies, oil sales to Chinese refineries through ghost tanker fleets, gold settlement with Turkish intermediaries, and a growing network of front companies operating through the UAE and Oman. Russia was the last to join and the most consequential addition. When the United States and its European allies froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves in February 2022, Moscow did what Beijing and Tehran had privately urged for years. It began dismantling its dependency on Western financial infrastructure as an emergency national priority. Russian oil was rerouted to India, China, and Turkey. Ruble-yuan trade settlement was activated. SWIFT alternatives that had been developed as contingency plans became operational necessities. The Russian freeze was the moment that transformed four parallel adaptation strategies into a coordinated alternative system. It demonstrated to China, which holds $3.2 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, that even the largest economies were not protected from financial confiscation. Beijing accelerated its own parallel infrastructure development with new urgency. The CRINK Bloc was not formed by a treaty or a formal declaration. It was formed by a shared enemy and the rational decision of four governments that individual adaptation was no longer sufficient. The economic structure of the bloc operates with China at the center, a position of extraordinary leverage. China is simultaneously the primary trade partner of Russia, Iran, and North Korea, the only economy on earth that occupies that position relative to three sanctioned states at once. In 2023, China-Russia bilateral trade reached $240 billion, an increase of 64% from pre-war levels. The transactions are settled primarily in yuan and rubles, with no dollar intermediation and no exposure to US correspondent banking. China-Iran trade, conducted largely through intermediaries in third countries and through a shadow tanker fleet that operates outside Western insurance and registration systems, is estimated at between $15 and $20 billion annually. Iranian crude flows to Chinese refineries at a discount to market price, providing China with cheap energy while providing Iran with the hard currency substitute it needs to fund imports. North Korea's trade with China represents approximately 90% of its total external commerce. The transactions occur across the Yalu River border in ways that bypass all international monitoring. Chinese goods moving north, North Korean coal and minerals moving south, settled through accounts and entities specifically structured to be opaque to outside scrutiny. The financial plumbing underneath these trade flows is the most significant structural development. China's Cross-Border Interbank Payment System (CIPS) now processes over $5 trillion in annual transactions, providing yuan-denominated settlement infrastructure that operates entirely outside SWIFT. Russia has developed its own financial messaging system (SPFS) as a domestic and bilateral alternative to SWIFT. Iran operates through informal hawala networks and cryptocurrency corridors. The result is a multi-layer payment architecture that can route value between bloc members without touching a single Western correspondent bank. What makes the CRINK bloc structurally different from a conventional trade arrangement is the fusion of economic exchange and military technology transfer. North Korea has supplied Russia with an estimated 3 to 5 million artillery shells since the Ukraine war began, a volume that exceeded what the entire NATO alliance provided to Ukraine in several comparable periods. In exchange, Russia has provided North Korea with satellite technology, submarine propulsion systems, re-entry vehicle expertise for ballistic missiles, and technical cooperation that has materially advanced Pyongyang's long-range strike capabilities. Kim Jong-un visited Russia in September 2023. Putin visited Pyongyang in June 2024. The relationship has been formalized as a mutual defense partnership. Iran supplied Russia with Shahid series kamikaze drones deployed extensively against Ukrainian power infrastructure. These drones cost approximately $20,000 each to produce, a fraction of the cost of the cruise missiles they replaced. Iran received Russian assistance in return, advanced air defense radar systems, Su-35 fighter aircraft, and accelerated cooperation on its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. China has not supplied weapons to Russia directly. Doing so would risk catastrophic secondary sanctions threatening its access to Western markets. Instead, China has supplied the dual-use components that sustain Russian defense production: semiconductors, precision machine tools, optical equipment, and electronics that flow through intermediaries in Central Asia, Turkey, and the UAE before reaching Russian factories. The US Treasury has designated dozens of Chinese companies for this activity. The designations slow the flow, they do not stop it. The most consequential long-term development within the CRINK bloc is not the current trade flows. It is the permanent financial infrastructure being constructed to sustain and expand those flows indefinitely. China's mBridge project, a central bank digital currency platform developed with partner central banks across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, is specifically designed to enable cross-border payment settlement without SWIFT involvement. It is operational. Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia have all expressed interest in participation. If mBridge reaches scale, it will provide the CRINK bloc with a payment backbone that is structurally immune to US sanctions, not because it hides transactions, but because it requires no Western correspondent banks, processes no dollar clearing, and generates no SWIFT messages that American authorities can intercept or block. Gold has re-emerged as a settlement medium between bloc members. Russia holds the world's fifth largest gold reserves and has been accumulating aggressively since 2014. Iran holds significant gold stocks accessed through Turkish and UAE intermediaries. North Korea mines gold domestically and uses it for arms procurement. China is the world's largest gold producer and has added to its central bank gold reserves at a record pace since 2022. Gold settlement requires no banking infrastructure, generates no SWIFT traffic, and leaves no trace in the Western financial monitoring system. Cryptocurrency provides the third layer. North Korea uses stolen digital assets directly to fund weapons procurement. Iran uses cryptocurrency to pay for sanctioned imports. Russian entities use cryptocurrency to route funds around frozen accounts. The US Treasury has sanctioned hundreds of crypto wallets and exchanges linked to CRINK activity. The ecosystem reconstitutes faster than it can be designated. The United States has not been passive. Secondary sanctions, threatening to punish third country banks and companies for doing business with CRINK nations, have been deployed aggressively. Hundreds of Chinese, Emirati, Turkish, and Central Asian entities have been designated for facilitating sanctions evasion. Several major Chinese banks reduced Russia-related business in late 2023 to avoid US Treasury action. But the structural response has been inadequate for a fundamental reason. The United States is attempting to enforce financial isolation against an economic coalition that includes the second largest economy on Earth, one that remains America's largest trading partner. Every secondary sanction imposed on a Chinese entity is a data point that Beijing uses internally to justify accelerating alternative infrastructure. Every designation of a Chinese company for Russia-related activity adds to the political case in Beijing for deeper CRINK integration. China does not need to choose between the CRINK bloc and the Western trading system, at least not yet. It simply needs to keep building until the alternative system is large enough to function without Western participation. Here is the paradox that American financial strategy created. Sanctions applied individually to each CRINK nation gave each government years to adapt, develop workarounds, and build the institutions needed to survive financial exclusion. North Korea adapted over 18 years, Iran adapted over 40. Russia had 8 years between 2014 and 2022 to reduce dollar dependency before the full freeze came. Each adaptation, developed in isolation for domestic survival, turned out to be compatible with every other adaptation because they were all solving the same problem. The United States did not intend to create the CRINK bloc. It created 4 countries with powerful incentives to find each other, share their solutions, and build common infrastructure. China did not set out to become the financial backbone of a sanctions-resistant parallel economy. It built CIPS for yuan internationalization, M-Bridge for digital currency development, and alternative trade channels for its own energy and commercial interests. But that infrastructure, built for Chinese purposes, is now the operational foundation of the most serious challenge to dollar-based financial order since Bretton Woods. The most powerful financial weapon in history was used so aggressively that it forged the alliance most likely to render it obsolete, and that alliance is not waiting, it is building.